Hello class, today we're talking about population and community ecology. Some learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to talk about how ecologists measure population size and density, population distributions, mortality rates, survivorship curves, exponential and logistic growth, carrying capacities, density-dependent versus density-independent growth regulation, human population growth, how we humans have expanded the carrying capacity of our habitat. We're relating growth in the age structure to various economic features, long-term implications of unchecked human population growth, the predator-prey cycle with some examples, and competitive exclusion, symbiosis, and a community structure and succession. We don't have much to say about communities, but we will discuss them. Okay, moving on to the lesson, starting with demographics and dynamics. So populations themselves are groups of species within a given area in a given time, and they're very dynamic. They're changing in size and demographics being the population itself, how it's composed versus age. Do you have a bunch of young individuals, older individuals, etc.? So we need some ways to study this, and so we have demography being a statistical study of the populations itself, originally designed for human populations. And one of the tools that we have to describe this, and we will look at an example in a second, is the life table. And so we are describing the life expectancy of an individual within a population. And this seemingly was invented by insurance companies to help calculate the insurance rates based on an individual's life expectancy. So some ways to quantify population include size and density. They are sort of inversely related, but your size then is the total number of individuals, which becomes important for reasons of genetic diversity, as we'll see, and then density, the number of individuals per unit area, which affects competition and the like. So population size is affecting potential for adaptation because presumably you could correlate a size of a population with a diversity of genetic material. Now I could think of some examples where that might not be true, but generally more is better here. Population density, though, is forcing interactions in these populations, and so competing for space, competing for food, competing for mates. These are things that are being driven by the population density. And so, as mentioned before, size and density are actually inversely related in many cases. Here's an example in figure 19.2 of a chart showing Australian mammals having this strong linear inverse relationship between their density, so their occurrence per a given area, and their body size. So the bigger you get, the more space you need. So we need accurate models to actually help us understand population size. It's not as easy as just going out and counting all of the individuals within a population. That might not be economically or even logistically feasible. And so what you would do then is take a sample, and assuming the sample is representative, you could then scale it up to the appropriate level. And so one way we can take a sample is by using a quadrat. So a quadrat is a square of known area, usually made out of metal or wood or plastic. You place it sort of randomly, and then you count all the stuff within that boundaries. And so this works really well for non-modal sort of plants, small stuff, etc. But you can do this on a larger scale with other animals as well. You can also use a mark and recapture style strategy where you are catching these organisms, marking them, and then releasing them back into the wild. And so then when you resample, you'll determine how many were previously marked, and you can relate that to this formula here, where the number marked first catch times the total number the second catch divided by the number marked the second catch equals n. And so you can actually use this to quantify how large the population is. So how the species actually clusters when it's out in its environment is also important as well. So we can obtain information about populations by looking at how they tend to distribute in their environments. We call this a species distribution pattern. And so some common patterns then are random, in which case the individual is sort of randomly placed in the environment without regard for other individuals in the environment. They can clump together, so you see this in herd animals. Or they could be uniformly spaced. You see this in situations where they're sort of colonial, but perhaps they need their own space as well. They're territorial. And so figure 19.3 gives us some good examples of each of these. In a random distribution, something like a dandelion that's abiotically pollinated and then sends its seeds out into the wind. And elephants, for example, are clumped together because they herd and move as a group. And then the penguins are sort of uniform because they are territorial birds. So we've brought up this idea of demography before. It's a statistical study of populations and how they change over time. So birth rates, death rates, life expectancies, these are all included in this study. And the life table that we mentioned earlier is sort of giving this information in regards to life expectancy at any given age. And so a couple things go into this, but one of these is the mortality rate. So this is your proportion of population that can survive to the beginning of an age interval that then dies during the age interval. So this is the rate then of death, of mortality. And so you'll have a survivorship curve from this. You're actually getting quantifiable data. It's the number of individuals surviving at each age interval then versus, of course, the time. And essentially, looking at these survivorship curves, you can actually compare the life histories of these various populations. And so we have this formula for mortality rate, the number of individuals dying divided by the number of individuals surviving times 1,000. That gives you your mortality rate. So here are 3 examples of survivorship curves. So humans and mammals have a type 1 survivorship curve. Death is usually occurring in our older years. We're making it through life stages until we're older. Type 2 survivorship curves would be something like a bird. Death at any age is just equally probable in these type 2 cases. And then a type 3 survivorship curve, very few are surviving in their younger ages, but once you reach a certain age, you're pretty good. You're more likely to survive into old age. So those are the 3 types of survivorship curves. So here is an example of a life table. This is the life table of the doll sheep. And so we're seeing a couple of variables here being looked at. So we're given an age interval in years, the number dying in that age interval out of 1,000 born, the number surviving the beginning of an age interval, the mortality rate per 1,000 that were alive at the beginning of the interval, and then the given life expectancy at that time. So what you see then for the doll sheep is, if you look at the column D, the mortality rate, so from 0 to half a year, so 6 months, the life expectancy is pretty low, like 7, right? And then as you age from 8 out, or sorry, pretty high. And then as you age from 8+ years out, the life expectancy falls. So the data indicates that the sheep in this population survive to 1, then it can be expected to survive another 7.7 years, but as this moves on, as the age increases, there is less likely chance that the animal will survive. So moving on to population growth and regulation. So we need accurate models then to predict changes in the population in the future. The simplest way to do this then would be to look at a case where there's no limitations on resources and a case where there is. And even that is an oversimplification. But in a case where we're just looking at growth itself, not looking at resource use, we would call that an exponential growth. The accelerating growth pattern seen in populations where resources are not the limiting factor, this will actually produce a J-shaped growth curve. And so we give this sort of growth rate formula here, where the death rate, D, which is the number of organisms that die, from the birth rate, B, the number of organisms that are born. We combine D and B into this term called R. Population growth is R times N, where R can be positive, in which case your population is increasing. It can be negative, your population is decreasing, or it can be zero, so you'll have no population growth. So that was exponential, J-shaped curves. Logistic is similar, but it is exponential growth up until you hit a limiting factor, a carrying capacity. It levels off due to limiting resources. And so what you see then is an S-shaped curve as you hit that carrying capacity. In this case, K, the maximum population size that a particular environment can sustain. So this is, the resources out there are sort of finite, and if you were allowed to just reproduce exponentially, then of course you would consume them. And what happens when you consume them is your population will begin to level off as they starve. So this is that idea. The competition will intensify with population, so some individuals may actually have a phenotypic adaptation that is more fit. And so this is where you start to see competition push one way or another. This is intra-specific competition because it's between members of the same species in the same population. So examples of both of these. A is a yeast grown in ideal conditions, and so you have a sort of classical S-shaped, a S-shaped logistic curve as it hits its carrying capacity. Right? There are only so many nutrients within the test tube. So it begins, it grows exponentially at first, and then it uses the nutrients that are available. In B, we have sort of a more realistic scenario where there is a natural population of seals, and their population is actually fluctuating with real-world conditions. It's not so much that they're being limited by their resources, but perhaps other things are coming into play, predation, weather events, etc. So this falls under dynamics and population regulation. These exponential and logistic models are good for simple models, but they are not accounting for variations in the carrying capacity of the environment. And that can be due to seasonal changes, it can be due to natural events, weather events, volcanic eruptions, etc., and interspecific competition between species. So perhaps other species are also competing for the same resources. Perhaps the seals or whatever you're looking at are being predated, but you need other models to sort of bring these factors into play. We can make some distinctions whether or not these factors are due to population density or independent of them, and these things are controlling population growth. So if it's a density dependent factor, then the density of the population is affecting the growth rate. If it's a density independent factor, mortality in a population is going to occur regardless of that factor. So it's independent of the density itself. So as mentioned, there are other models that are looking at other things. In this case, a demographics-based population model is looking at the adaptations that might actually push us towards fitness, but life history characteristics such as birth rate, age at first reproduction, offspring rate, death rates, these are all being pushed by fitness and selection pressures. And we're existing across a continuum then of all the species. So K-selected species have been pushed towards stable environments, relatively large offspring, and parental care. So they're actually nurturing their offspring possibly for long periods of time, many years. Example of that would be elephants. Then there are R-selected species on the other side of the continuum. So a species that is suited to changing environments, very dynamic, produces a lot of offspring and it's not caring for them. It's just putting them out in the environment and then leaving them to do as they will. An example of that would be dandelions, mice, cockroach. You can see how many species would fall somewhere on this spectrum and probably actually have traits of both of these. Moving on to the human population, you can apply these models that we've talked about to human growth as well. Probably not that weird since we're animals as well, but we are currently in exponential growth and actually have been since about 1000 AD, as evidenced by this figure here. And as your population begins to grow, it becomes easier to add more population. Right? This is how this exponential growth actually works. 123 years were necessary to add 1 billion humans between 1804 and 1930, but only 24 years between 1975 and 1999, we added a whole nother billion to our population. That is how exponential growth works. This rate is likely to start decreasing, and there are a number of reasons why, but what we see with industrialization is that people just tend to have less kids when their quality of life increases and they have stable jobs. And so we will likely see in the future, and there's actually a statistic from the UN about this, but a leveling off and then finally a decrease of the human population. One of the things that sets us apart is that we have been able to overcome density-dependent regulation. One of the ways that we can do that is by altering our environment. And of course, other animals alter their environments as well, but not to the extent that we do. So migration, of course, we originated in Africa. We're going to colonize all of the habitable land that we can. Health, we've improved our sanitation practices, our health infrastructure. We've invented antibiotics and vaccines to decrease our death rate from infectious pathogens. Industrialization and the use of fossil fuels have increased our productivity immensely. So it actually takes less of us to do the same jobs that it used to do. So declining life expectancy would be an indicator for higher mortality rates and ultimately lead to lower birth rates. That's what you see when you increase the quality of life. We're starting to see the implication of this sort of unfold in real time. You might hear it called a demographic crisis or a demographic cliff. Many nations around the world are going to have to deal with this in the next century. Essentially, we're getting to the point where there are going to be more old people that need to be supported by less young people. And we call this an age structure. An age structure is a proportion of a population in different age classes. And so it tends to form these pyramids or inverse pyramids depending on which side of this equation you are. And this is important because models that actually incorporate these age structures allow you to better predict economic things. How many people are going to be in the workforce in 20 years? That's something you need to account for by age, because if you're waiting on or relying on people over 65 to be in the workforce 20 years from now, that's probably not going to happen. And so we see these age structure diagrams describing our populations essentially. So stage 1 is rapid growth, very pyramidal. It's kind of these S-shaped outer walls, and then stage 2 is slow growth, so still pyramidal. Stage 3 kind of stable. Now we're kind of having less old people up top, but still having more young people at the bottom to support them. And then stage 4, we have inverted our pyramid, and now there are less young people and more middle age supporting the old people. So this is definitely something that we'll have to sort of wrestle with in the next century. But you can see here the percent growth rate of populations in different countries. So it's not exactly universal, and it does look like my figure got cut off a little bit with the key, but it's essentially showing that there are areas of the world that still have positive population growth, and there are areas of the world that are already undergoing negative population growth. So what are the long-term implications of our human exponential growth? Well, eventually we're going to get off of this cycle, but unchecked human population growth could not continue anyway indefinitely. And we've already attempted moderation on this. China had the one-child policy in which you would impose a fine on couples who had more than one child. And so this caused problems of its own, but this was ended formally in 2016. But essentially, we face the same problem that any organism would face when it's consuming all the resources available to it, you get to have these inequalities. So less access to food and resources widening as you tend to increase this competition. So we need to reconcile human impact on the environment with our ability to produce. And so there are a couple of ways, of course, we can make our production more efficient. And that's one of the things that we've done. But the United Nations is estimating that the future world population could vary from 6 billion to 16 billion by the year 2100. And the evidence that I saw for this, it tend to suggest that humanity is going to top out about 9.6 billion people, and then we'll begin to decrease by 2100. Okay, finally we come to community ecology. And so what is a community? Well, it's all of these populations interacting together in their environments. So species do not exist in a vacuum. They are interacting with and competing with other species. And so these other populations then of these species is forming a community, an ecological community. And so within this community, one important relationship you see is the predator-prey relationship. So in this case, one individual is killing and then consuming the other individual, and it's like primary consumers versus producers, essentially at its base level. So herbivores eating plants, but it also could be a heterotroph eating another heterotroph. But this is a push and pull relationship. So the prey will evolve sort of adaptations that help it resist predation as well. So in the case of plants, of course, they have some mechanical defenses, stuff like thorns. They'll have chemical defenses like toxins. Perhaps they taste bad. Perhaps they're extremely toxic. There are biological mechanisms like attracting ants to help keep you safe. But in the case of organisms that are like brightly colored to indicate, hey, I don't taste good or I'm toxic, some other organisms may try and take advantage of that and actually use a similar physical appearance in a phenomenon called mimicry. So a completely harmless species will imitate warning colorations of the actual harmful species to try and take advantage of the predator recognizing those colors and saying, hey, this isn't going to taste good. So here's some examples of plant defenses that you can actually see around here. Of course, the honey locust itself is going to have these big thorns, and then that is a mechanical defense. And then digitalis, or foxglove, it's a common ornamental plant. They're very pretty, but they also have a cardiac glycoside. It actually can be used pharmaceutically, but it has a very low toxic dose, so it's very dangerous. Okay, so within communities, you have competition. Well, resources are going to be limited, and so competition over those resources can be quite fierce. And the set of resources that a species is actually taking advantage of, as well as its interactions with other species, we would call that organism's niche. And two organisms cannot occupy the same niche indefinitely. They cannot coexist if they're competing for the same resources. We call this the competitive exclusion principle. They are simply, at some point, one of them will win out over the other. And so the example they give in the book is Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. They grow well individually, but when you stick them together in the same tube and they have to actually compete for resources, Paramecium aurelia is going to outcompete that Paramecium caudatum. And so this happens. There are some ways around this, of course. You can partition the niche in such a way that one species is using nutrients that is sort of unavailable to the others, but in this instance, you will not be able to have two species within the same niche actually coexist for those same resources. Some other interesting interactions you see out in communities involve symbiosis. So this is a phenomenon in which these species are in long-term interactions that may actually benefit one another. And we have a couple different kinds here. So in a commensal situation, one species is benefiting, but the other species is sort of indifferent. It's not receiving a benefit, but it's not being hurt either. And so one example that I really like is the Spanish moss that you see hanging off the oak tree. The oak tree doesn't actually get anything from it, but the Spanish moss does get a little bit higher up in the canopy. Mutualism is sort of our colloquial use of symbiosis. If I said something had a symbiotic relationship just in a casual conversation, I'm probably referring to mutualism, in which both species are actually benefiting from the interaction. So a good example of this would be the ants that actually farm aphids. Some ants keep aphids kind of like livestock, but they're actually protecting the aphids from predation by like ladybugs. And in return, the aphids are giving the ants a sugar-rich nectar. So that is an example of a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. Now, what happens when that relationship is not beneficial to one party? We call that parasitism. So it's an interaction where one organism is feeding off another without immediately killing it. So the parasite doesn't actually have an impetus to kill its host, the host being the organism being fed upon. In fact, if it can keep the host alive longer, then it will obviously be able to feed that much longer. We also include viruses in this parasite class. Viruses are not technically alive. They are acellular, but they need host cells to help them reproduce because they don't have the reproductive machinery to actually reproduce themselves. They need to use the host reproductive machinery. And so in that way, they are parasites as well. And so here is an example of a tapeworm life cycle. So this is the human tapeworm. It basically has to go through these developmental stages and perhaps pass through an animal like a pig or something like that before it can actually return to us. So some broader characteristics of communities then. The communities are going to be characterized by their ultimate structure, so the number of populations and their size, as well as how they interact. And then how are those changing, the dynamics of it? We describe this with biodiversity. So this is how rich your species actually is. So the number of species living in a habitat or other unit. We can use this to study island biogeography, for instance, trying to explain the high species richness found on isolated islands, but also how that relates to their mainland cousins. And then relative species abundance, so the number of individual species in a species relative to the total number of individuals in all species within a system. So is one species kind of dominating with a high population size, and why would that be? All that factors into biodiversity. But when you're talking about communities, you also have these foundational and keystone species as well. So the foundational species are usually the primary producers. They're the base of the community, the base of the food web. They're often the primary producers like phytoplanktons and grasses and stuff like that. So they're usually very abundant. You also have these keystone species. So keystone species are important regulators then of the community. They have sort of an inordinate influence in maintaining other species in this ecosystem. And so they are often like the apex predator. In the instance they give, it's like starfish eating oysters and stuff. You remove all the starfish, then the oysters get out of whack. But it can be other stuff as well. It could be like a limiting factor in a certain nutrients that only a certain type of fish is putting into the water via their digestive cycle. So in the instance of a coral reef, of course, the coral is the foundational species of the reef ecosystem. Dynamics, of course, the community itself is very dynamic, changing over time due to, of course, just natural events like even environmental disturbances, weather events, volcanoes, earthquakes, etc. And when this happens, you get a disturbance. So you need to succeed then, and we have a couple different terms for succession. It's the sequential appearance and disappearance of species over time in a community after a severe disturbance. So a primary succession is when a new landmass is being formed and then gets colonized. So volcano erupts out in the middle of the ocean, this lava-rich rock sort of solidifies. It has to be colonized by a primary successor first and then broken down. We actually call those pioneer species. They're the first species to appear in succession, and they can help to process and sort of pave the way for these secondary successors. But in a secondary succession, you're taking an existing ecosystem, disturbing it, but perhaps not destroying everything. There'll still be remnants from the previous community, and so you'll see there be a cycle where these remainders sort of fill in. And so, for example, here is secondary successions of oak and hickory forest. And so you have a pioneer species like an annual plant will grow. It will be succeeded by woodier plants and taller plants and eventually small trees, shrubs, these intermediate species. And young oak and hickory will begin to grow. And then finally in the climax community you'll have these mature oak and hickory forests. So that is the end of population and community ecology. Please take the quiz and do the reflections. We'll try to get the third exam published today.